Phelps County, Nebraska, 1876. While every homesteader raced to throw up quick-claim shanties with boards and nails, one Swedish immigrant was still cutting blocks from the prairie itself in late summer. His neighbors called it backwards. They called him a fool. Rolf Johnson was building walls from sawed bricks, 2 feet long, 12 inches wide, 4 inches thick, stacking them like masonry into walls nearly 2 feet deep. Most settlers framed with lumber, thinking speed meant survival. Johnson cut an entire acre of prairie grass into blocks, layering each course grass side down, binding every few rows for stability. He spent months on what others finished in weeks, creating what mockers called a house that would rain dirt. Then November 10th arrived. Prairie fire erupted across the valley, flames leaping 30 feet high, moving with the speed of a racehorse. Frame buildings with their dry boards and tarred seams vanished in minutes. But that fool's soddy? Its earthen walls and dirt-covered roof stood untouched while wooden structures around it turned to ash. What did this immigrant understand about fire resistance and prairie building that experienced American homesteaders had completely missed? And how did his neighbor's mockery turn into desperate requests to learn his grass wall construction methods? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The train deposited Rolf Johnson and his family at the Grand Island Depot on a blistering August morning in 1876, along with 24 other Swedish families carrying tools, seed grain, and the unshakable belief that free land meant opportunity. The reality of Phelps County hit them before they'd traveled 10 miles west of the railroad, an endless sweep of prairie grass stretching to every horizon, broken only by creek bottoms lined with cottonwood and willow. No pine forests, no oak groves, no timber of any consequence for 100 miles in any direction. The men who'd framed houses back in Illinois and Wisconsin stood in their wagon beds, squinting across the grassland, calculating board feet that simply didn't exist. Most families made the obvious choice. They'd haul lumber from Grand Island or Kearney, paying railroad prices that consumed half their cash reserves before they'd driven a single nail. The Andersons ordered pre-cut framing timber. The Carlsons pooled money for a boxcar load of siding and shingles. The Olsons decided to build a dugout first, then upgrade to frame construction once they had earned a crop. Everyone understood the logic: get a roof overhead fast, survive the first winter, improve the claim later when money allowed. Rolf Johnson looked at the same treeless landscape and reached a different conclusion. He walked his 160 acres on foot, pulling up handfuls of prairie sod, testing the density of root systems that had been weaving themselves into an underground mat for thousands of years. The grass grew thick and tough, buffalo grass, blue stem, and grama forming a network of roots that extended 3 feet down in some places. When he cut a square with his spade, the block held together like a brick made of earth and fiber. He'd found his building material growing right under his feet. His neighbors watched him sharpen a breaking plow, what the locals called a grasshopper plow for the way it sliced through sod, and assumed he was preparing to plant. Instead, Johnson began cutting the prairie into strips 12 inches wide and 4 inches thick, slicing through the root mat in parallel lines across his best grass. Then he cross-cut the strips into lengths of about 3 feet, creating blocks that 2 men could lift and position. Each sod brick weighed roughly 50 pounds, heavy enough to stack without mortar, dense enough to shed rain when properly laid. The mockery started immediately. "You're building a house that'll rain dirt on your supper," called out Lars Anderson, pausing his lumber hauling to watch Johnson stack his first course. "Grass walls won't keep out wind, let alone wolves." The other Swedish families found the spectacle amusing, a grown man playing with mud pies while serious homesteaders erected proper frame structures with actual walls and real shingles. They'd come to America to live better than their fathers, not to burrow into the ground like prairie dogs. Johnson ignored the commentary and continued his methodical construction. He laid each sod brick grass side down, the living roots forming the bottom face of his wall. The first course formed the foundation, laid directly on prairie ground that he'd leveled but not excavated. The second course overlapped the joints of the first, creating a running bond pattern identical to brick masonry. Every third or fourth course, he turned half the bricks perpendicular to the others, creating tie courses that bound the wall together into a single structural mass. The walls rose slowly, 2 bricks wide, nearly 2 feet thick, massive compared to the board and batten construction his neighbors favored. The mathematics were simple but daunting. A typical soddy measuring 12 by 14 feet required approximately 3,000 sod bricks. At 50 bricks per day, a realistic pace for cutting, hauling, and laying, Johnson faced 2 months of steady labor before he'd have walls. His neighbors could frame and side a cabin in 3 weeks using lumber, tar paper, and store-bought nails. They finished their claims while Johnson was still laying his 6th course, and they made sure he understood their opinion of his methods. "Rolf's building a fort to fight Indians that ain't been through here in 10 years, joked Emil Carlson, whose own cabin stood complete with painted clapboards and a brick chimney ordered from Omaha. "All that work for a dirt house that'll melt in the first hard rain." The community had reached consensus. Johnson was either stubborn beyond reason or too poor to buy proper materials. Either way, his laborious construction project had become entertainment for families who'd made sensible choices. Johnson pressed on because he was calculating different risks than his neighbors considered. Frame buildings burned fast and completely. They leaked heat through board gaps, requiring constant fuel to maintain warmth. They caught fire from chimney sparks, lightning strikes, or grass fires that swept across the prairie every few years. Most critically, they depended on materials that had to be purchased and transported, making repairs expensive and sometimes impossible. Sod construction used the renewable resource that surrounded every homestead, prairie grass that grew back each spring, thicker than before. By September, his walls stood complete at 7 feet high, topped with a plate log that would carry the roof load. The structure looked exactly like what his neighbors expected, a crude earthen box that belonged in medieval Europe, not modern America. They watched him begin roof construction with the same bemused attention they'd given his wall laying, certain that his grassroots building materials would prove inadequate when the first blizzard arrived. What they couldn't see was the thermal mass Johnson had created, nearly 2 feet of earth and organic matter that would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through long winter nights, creating a natural temperature regulation system that no frame building could match. The last sod brick went into place on October 1st, just as his neighbors were finishing their final chinking and preparing for winter. Johnson's soddy squatted low on the prairie like a natural hill, its earthen walls invisible from a distance, while frame cabins stood tall and proud, announcing human presence for miles around. The contrast seemed to confirm everyone's judgment about who'd built wisely and who'd wasted precious time playing with dirt. The ridicule shifted from amusement to genuine concern as Johnson began roof construction in early October. His neighbors had watched the wall building with the tolerance reserved for harmless eccentrics, but the roof represented the critical test of any frontier structure. "Your roof will fail first," predicted Lars Anderson, pointing at the massive sod walls that would have to support whatever Johnson planned to span across the top. "Those dirt walls can't carry a proper roof load, and you can't thatch grass thick enough to keep out Nebraska weather." The skepticism contained a hard truth that every plain settler understood. Roofing materials separated survivors from casualties when winter storms arrived. Most homesteaders used whatever they could afford: split shingles if money allowed, tar paper and boards for the budget-conscious, sod laid over poles for the desperate. Each approach carried known risks. Shingles lasted but burned easily. Tar paper shed water but tore in high winds. Sod roofs leaked unless built perfectly, and most weren't built perfectly because few men understood the engineering principles that made earthen roofs work. Johnson started with structural fundamentals that his critics couldn't fault. He positioned a ridgepole down the center of his 12 by 14-foot span, supporting it with posts sunk into the earthen floor. The ridge beam would carry the peak load of everything above it: rafters, sheathing, sod layers, and the accumulated weight of snow that might pile 3 feet deep by February. He cut rafters from cottonwood logs hauled from Plum Creek, spacing them 18 inches apart along both sides of the ridge. Each rafter measured 6 inches in diameter, substantial enough to support distributed loads, but light enough for 2 men to lift into position. The rafter installation drew a small crowd of neighboring homesteaders who arrived ostensibly to help, but actually to witness what they expected would be structural failure. "Those poles won't hold when you start piling dirt up there," warned Emil Carlson, examining the rafter spacing with the eye of a man who'd built barns back in Wisconsin. 18 inches on center might work for shingles, but sod weighs 10 times what cedar shakes weigh. You'll have sagging by Christmas and collapse by spring. Johnson acknowledged the weight concern, but continued laying his foundation layer, willow branches, and small poles arranged perpendicular to the rafters, creating a rough platform that would support the sod courses above. The willow came from creek bottoms where it grew in dense thickets, cut green so it would bend without breaking under load. He wove the branches between rafters like basket work, overlapping each piece by at least 6 inches, creating a flexible mat that distributed weight evenly across the rafter system. The technique was neither new nor experimental. Scandinavian builders had used similar methods for centuries, and plains tribes had developed their own variations using local materials. Over the willow foundation, Johnson began laying sod exactly as he'd built his walls: grass side down, joints staggered, courses overlapping to prevent water penetration. But roof sod required different specifications than wall sod. He cut thinner blocks, roughly 3 inches thick instead of 4, reducing weight while maintaining the root structure that held each piece together. The first layer went directly onto the willow, fitted tightly to eliminate gaps where water might pool or penetrate. Each subsequent layer overlapped the one below by several inches, creating a shingled effect that shed moisture toward the eaves. The watching homesteaders noticed details that impressed them despite their skepticism. Johnson's sod courses followed the same careful bonding pattern he'd used in wall construction, with tie courses running perpendicular every few layers to bind the roof into a single structural unit. His joints were tight enough to prevent wind-driven rain from penetrating, yet flexible enough to accommodate the seasonal expansion and contraction that destroyed poorly built earthen roofs. Most importantly, he was building thickness into the system, not just a single layer of sod, but multiple courses that would eventually total 6 inches of earth and organic matter. "I'll grant you this," admitted Gustav Olsen, running his hands along the completed section of roof. "It's better work than I expected from grass and dirt, but you're still asking those rafters to carry more weight than they're rated for. When the first big snow hits, we'll see if cottonwood can handle what pine barely manages." Johnson's response was to add the final component that his neighbors hadn't anticipated: a top layer of plain dirt, carefully selected and screened to eliminate rocks and large organic debris. He spread the soil 6 inches deep across the entire roof surface, creating a smooth cap that would shed water, resist wind erosion, and provide the thermal mass that made sod roofs superior to conventional alternatives. The dirt layer added significant weight, but it also created a living system that would actually improve over time as grass seeds took root and established a natural waterproof membrane. The completed roof represented engineering principles that most frontier builders had never encountered. The multiple layers created redundancy. If one level failed, others continued functioning. The thermal mass moderated interior temperatures, keeping the house cooler in summer and warmer in winter than any frame structure could achieve. The organic materials formed a living system that would adapt to environmental stresses, growing stronger rather than weaker as roots established themselves in the earthen cap. What his neighbors couldn't fully appreciate was the fire resistance Johnson had built into his entire structure. While frame buildings offered kindling to any spark that reached them, his sod construction presented only earth and living vegetation to potential flames. The roof alone contained more fire-resistant material than most homesteads possessed in their entire structures. In a landscape where grass fires swept across the prairie every few seasons, Johnson had built a fortress that would resist what wood couldn't survive. By late October, Johnson's soddy stood complete, walls 2 feet thick, roof 6 inches deep in earth, the entire structure blending into the prairie landscape as if it had grown there naturally. His neighbors had finished their claims weeks earlier and were already banking earth around their foundations for winter insulation, but they found themselves returning to examine Johnson's work with growing respect for the craftsmanship, if not the concept. The man who'd seemed foolish in August had demonstrated building skills that exceeded most of their own abilities, even if he'd applied those skills to materials they considered primitive. The real test would come when weather arrived to prove which approach had been wisest. November 10th dawned clear and still, with temperatures climbing into the 70s by midday, unseasonably warm weather that had continued for nearly a week. Rolf Johnson and his brother Justus hitched their wagon before sunrise to make the long haul to the Platte River bottoms, where they could cut cottonwood for winter fuel. The journey would consume most of the day, but deadfall timber along the river meant free firewood for families willing to work for it. Most homesteaders in Phelps County made the same calculation: burn what you could haul rather than purchase coal that cost more than many families earned in a month. By afternoon, the brothers had loaded nearly a cord of seasoned wood and were preparing for the return journey when Justus noticed the smell. Not wood smoke from their noon cooking fire, but something thicker and more acrid carried on air that had begun moving from the southwest. The breeze brought other scents too: the distinctive odor of burning grass, dry earth heated beyond normal temperatures, and an underlying metallic smell that experienced plainsmen recognized as the signature of large fires moving fast across open ground. The horizon confirmed what their noses had detected. A thin brown line stretched across the southwestern sky, too uniform to be a dust storm, too dark to be normal cloud formation. As they watched, the line thickened and began showing orange highlights that flickered against the darkening sky. Prairie fire, moving northeast with the prevailing wind, consuming everything in its path at a speed that would bring it to their location before nightfall. Johnson made the decision that would define the next 6 hours: load the wagon and race for home rather than seek shelter along the river. The Platte offered safety from fire, but no protection for their families or livestock 20 miles away. The race would be close. Prairie fires moved at roughly 15 miles per hour under normal wind conditions, faster when pushed by strong gusts. A heavily loaded wagon could maintain 8 to 10 miles per hour over good ground, less when crossing creek beds or climbing ridges. The mathematics were harsh, but not impossible if they started immediately and drove without stopping. The brothers pushed their team harder than good husbandry recommended, alternating between fast trots and brief walking periods that prevented the horses from foundering. Behind them, the fire line grew broader and more distinct, showing individual flame fronts that leaped and danced above the burning grass. The sound reached them first as a distant rumble, like thunder that never stopped, then evolved into something more complex: the roar of wind-feeding flames, the crack of burning stems, and an underlying hiss that experienced firefighters recognized as the sound of moisture being driven from living vegetation at temperatures that killed everything they touched. By late afternoon, individual flame tongues were visible above the prairie swells, leaping 30 feet or more into the air when they encountered thick grass or accumulated debris. The fire was consuming everything organic in its path, not just the current year's growth, but root systems, seed beds, and accumulated mulch that represented decades of botanical development. What had been living prairie in the morning would be blackened earth by evening, stripped of everything that could burn, and left as barren as plowed ground. The Johnson homestead came into view just as the leading edge of the fire crested the ridge 2 miles southwest of their claim. From that distance, the flames looked deceptively small and manageable, but the sound had grown into a continuous roar punctuated by explosive cracks when the fire reached creek beds lined with dry brush. The smoke column now filled a quarter of the sky, carrying ash and burning debris that fell like snow across the entire valley. Justus unhitched the horses while Rolf ran for the soddy to collect his wife and children. The decision tree was simple but critical: what could be saved and what had to be abandoned to the flames. Livestock went into the creek bed where they might survive if the water didn't dry up. Essential tools and seed grain went into the soddy where thick earthen walls might protect them. Everything else, outbuildings, haystacks, rail fences, would have to take their chances against 30-foot flames moving faster than a man could run. The fire's arrival eliminated theoretical concerns about sod construction and replaced them with immediate practical tests. Johnson's neighbors had scattered to their own emergency preparations, but several families had decided their frame buildings offered insufficient protection and were moving children and valuables to the one structure in the valley that might withstand direct flame contact. The Andersons arrived with 2 wagons full of household goods. The Carlsons brought their livestock and a trunk containing family documents. Even Gustav Olsen, who'd been most vocal about the impracticality of dirt houses, appeared at Johnson's door with his wife and infant daughter. The Saudis' fire resistance became apparent as the flames approached within a quarter mile. Frame buildings in the path had already begun showing heat damage, paint blistering, wood siding starting to char from radiant heat alone. But Johnson's earthen walls showed no effects from temperatures that were making wooden structures nearly too hot to touch. The 6 inches of soil covering his roof remained cool enough for a man to stand on, while wooden shingles on neighboring buildings were beginning to smoke from heat that hadn't even reached them yet. Johnson's fire preparation followed principles he'd learned from older settlers who'd survived previous grass fires. The critical points were draft control and gap, sealing, preventing the fire from drawing air through the structure, and eliminating any openings where sparks or burning debris could enter. He blocked the stovepipe with wet rags and muddy clay, sealed gaps around the doorframe with damp earth, and positioned water barrels against the interior walls where they could be reached quickly if spot fires started inside. The flames reached the Johnson claim at sunset, moving with what Rolfe would later describe in his diary as the speed of a racehorse. Wooden outbuildings vanished in minutes, the chicken coop, tool shed, and hay shelter disappearing so quickly that individual structures couldn't be identified in the wall of flame that swept across them. Fence posts became torches, then collapsed into piles of glowing coals. Rail fences burned from end to end like fuses, carrying fire in straight lines across areas where the grass was too sparse to maintain continuous combustion. But the Saudi held. The flames reached the earthen walls and found nothing to consume. Sparks landed on the soil-covered roof and died against earth that contained enough moisture to quench them. The fire passed around the structure like water flowing around a stone, leaving behind a building that stood intact on ground, stripped of every combustible material within sight. When morning came, the landscape looked like a vast plowed field dotted with scattered piles of ash that had once been buildings, fences, and haystacks. Only structures built entirely of earth and stone remained standing, proof that the prairie had tested every construction method with the impartial brutality of 30-foot flames. October 20th, 1878, brought the second test that would cement Johnson's reputation as the valley's most practical builder. The morning started with smoke on the southern horizon, not the towering column of a major prairie fire, but the low, spreading haze that indicated burning across a broad front. This fire was different from the November blaze 2 years earlier. It was moving faster, driven by wind gusts that reached 30 miles per hour, and it was heading directly toward the cluster of rebuilt homesteads that had risen from the ashes of the previous disaster. The community response showed how much the settlers had learned from their first encounter with prairie fire. Instead of scattering to individual defensive positions, the homesteaders gathered at Johnson's Saudi to coordinate their efforts under the leadership of the man whose building methods had already proven themselves under the worst possible conditions. Lars Anderson arrived with shovels and wet burlap sacks. Emil Carlson brought buckets and a barrel of creek water loaded onto his wagon. Gustav Olsen appeared with his sons and enough rope to organize a bucket brigade if water sources could be located and protected. Johnson took charge not through speeches or dramatic gestures, but by demonstrating the practical techniques that might save structures and lives when the flames arrived. The key was creating fire breaks using controlled burning, setting small fires that would consume available fuel in designated areas before the main fire could reach them. The technique required precise timing and favorable wind conditions, but it offered the only realistic chance of protecting buildings that couldn't be moved and livestock that couldn't be driven to safety. The backfire strategy depended on understanding how prairie fires moved and what fed their advance. Grass fires traveled by consuming standing vegetation in a continuous line, with flames leaping from one fuel source to the next in a chain reaction that continued until it ran out of combustible material. By burning selected strips ahead of the main fire, defenders could create zones where no fuel remained, forcing the advancing flames to lose intensity or change direction when they encountered areas that had already been consumed. Johnson selected the first backfire location on a ridge 600 yards southwest of the homestead cluster, where short grass and scattered bare patches would allow controlled burning without creating an unmanageable blaze. The wind direction was critical. Backfires had to burn against the prevailing breeze so they would advance slowly and remain under human control. If the wind shifted or intensified, the backfire could become as dangerous as the main fire, trapping the defenders between two advancing flame fronts. The timing required split-second decision-making based on wind speed, flame height, and the rate of advance shown by the approaching fire. Johnson lit the first strip when the main fire was still 2 miles away, allowing enough time for the backfire to create a substantial burn zone before the two flame fronts met. The controlled burn moved slowly across the ridge, consuming grass and small brush, but leaving the underlying soil intact and non-combustible. The backfire technique worked exactly as Johnson had calculated. When the main fire reached the burned strip, it lost the continuous fuel supply that had been driving its advance. The flames dropped from 30 feet to less than 10, then broke into scattered spot fires that could be attacked individually with wet burlap and shovels. What had been an unstoppable wall of fire became a series of manageable problems that could be solved by men working in coordination. But the October fire tested more than just firebreak strategy. The wind-driven flames moved with unprecedented speed, covering the final mile in less than 4 minutes and arriving at the defensive positions before some of the backfires had burned wide enough to be fully effective. Johnson found himself directing bucket brigades while simultaneously lighting additional backfires and coordinating the evacuation of livestock to creek beds that offered the only available refuge. The crisis moment came when shifting wind patterns caused one of the backfires to merge with a spot. Fire started by wind-blown embers, creating a new flame front that threatened to outflank the entire defensive line. Johnson made the decision that separated experienced firefighters from well-meaning amateurs. He ordered the immediate abandonment of exposed positions and the concentration of all personnel around the soddy, where thick earthen walls could provide protection if the fire control efforts failed completely. The retreat to Johnson's earthen fortress brought 23 people and a dozen head of livestock into a structure designed to house a single family. The crowding was uncomfortable but not dangerous. The sod walls were thick enough to prevent heat transfer, and the earth-covered roof remained cool even when flames passed directly overhead. Children huddled against interior walls that stayed at normal temperatures, while wooden buildings in the area reached surface temperatures that would have caused severe burns on human contact. Johnson's role during the final phase of the fire was less dramatic than his neighbors would later claim in their retelling of the events. He didn't fight the flames with superhuman courage or demonstrate miraculous knowledge of fire behavior. Instead, he applied the systematic approach that had guided his construction methods, identify the critical factors, prepare for the worst-case scenario, and execute proven techniques without deviation or improvisation. The fire passed within 2 hours, leaving behind a blackened landscape punctuated by the scattered foundations and chimneys of buildings that had been consumed despite defensive efforts. But the casualty count was remarkably low compared to similar fires in other parts of the territory. No human lives were lost, livestock casualties were minimal, and several frame buildings had been saved through the coordinated application of backfire techniques that Johnson had taught his neighbors. Most significantly, the community had learned to function as a coordinated unit rather than as isolated homesteads trying to solve individual problems. The Swedes who had mocked Johnson's dirt house 2 years earlier now sought his advice on construction techniques, fire prevention, and emergency preparation. His practical knowledge had become community knowledge, spreading from family to family as neighbors recognized the difference between theoretical understanding and proven methods tested under life-threatening conditions. When dawn revealed the extent of the damage, Johnson's soddy stood intact among foundations and ash piles that marked where wooden structures had been consumed. But more important than any single building was the demonstration that prairie fires could be fought successfully by settlers who understood the principles involved and worked together rather than separately. The man who had been called a fool for building with grass and dirt had become the valley's acknowledged expert on survival techniques that preserved lives and property when conventional methods failed. The transformation of community attitudes toward sod construction became apparent during the spring building season of 1879. What had begun as individual curiosity about Johnson's methods evolved into systematic apprenticeship as families rebuilt structures lost to the October fire. Lars Anderson was the first to approach Johnson with specific questions about sod brick dimensions and wall laying techniques. Emil Karlsson followed within days, asking for instruction in roof construction methods that could resist both fire and weather. By May, Johnson found himself serving as unofficial construction supervisor for half the homesteads in the valley. The learning process revealed how much practical knowledge had been embedded in techniques that neighbors had initially dismissed as primitive. Anderson discovered that cutting proper sod bricks required understanding seasonal grass growth patterns. Spring sod cut too early lacked the root density needed for structural integrity, while late summer sod had root systems so tough that cutting became nearly impossible. The optimal cutting season ran from mid-June through early August, when root networks had reached maximum development but hadn't yet become too fibrous to slice cleanly. Karlsson learned that successful sod construction depended on masonry principles that most frontier builders had never encountered. Each course had to be level and properly bonded to the courses below and above it. Joints had to be staggered to prevent vertical cracks that would weaken the entire wall. Tie courses running perpendicular to the main wall direction were essential every fourth or fifth layer to bind the structure into a unified mass rather than just stacked blocks. The techniques were identical to stone masonry, but applied to materials that could be cut and shaped on site without specialized tools. The Olsen family's reconstruction project became a community demonstration of advanced sod building methods that went beyond Johnson's original techniques. Gustav Olsen had decided to build larger than his previous cabin, 16 by 20 feet instead of the standard 12 by 14, which required engineering solutions for spanning greater distances and supporting heavier loads. Johnson helped design a wall system that used double-thick construction at the corners and around door openings, creating reinforced zones that could handle the additional stresses of expanded floor plans. The roof construction for Olsen's enlarged soddy introduced structural innovations that would influence building practices throughout the region. Instead of relying solely on cottonwood rafters spaced 18 inches apart, Johnson specified a ridge beam system that used laminated cottonwood logs, 3 smaller logs bound together with leather straps and wooden pins to create a beam stronger than any single timber available locally. The technique came from Scandinavian boat building, where laminated construction allowed builders to create curved structural members from straight wood pieces. The rafter system for the larger roof used a combination of cottonwood and willow that optimized both strength and flexibility. Primary rafters of 6-inch cottonwood logs carried the main structural loads, while secondary rafters of 4-inch willow filled the spaces between them, supporting the willow sheathing that formed the foundation for the sod layers. The dual species approach took advantage of each wood's specific characteristics: cottonwood for compression strength, willow for resilience under dynamic loads like wind gusts and settling. Johnson's instruction methods reflected his practical background rather than formal education. He demonstrated each technique by doing it correctly, then supervised his students through multiple repetitions until they could perform the work without guidance. Sod cutting required learning the proper angle for the plow blade, the correct depth for maximum root inclusion, and the timing that produced bricks with optimal moisture content. Too wet, and the blocks would slump during stacking. Too dry, and they would crack before the wall reached completion. Wall construction lessons focused on the details that separated successful sod buildings from structures that failed within their first winter. The grass side-down orientation wasn't arbitrary. It positioned the root network where it could continue growing and strengthening the wall rather than dying and creating weak spots. The staggered joint pattern wasn't just traditional masonry practice. It prevented water penetration and distributed loads evenly across multiple courses. The tie course system wasn't decorative. It bound individual walls into structural units capable of resisting wind loads that would topple unbonded construction. The most significant technical innovation emerged from the community's collective experience with different sod types and cutting methods. Johnson had originally used buffalo grass sod cut from native prairie, but the homesteaders discovered that cultivated areas produced superior building materials. Land that had been plowed and seeded to cultivated grasses developed root systems that were denser and more uniform than native sod, creating bricks that held together better and weathered more consistently. The discovery led to intentional sod farming, homesteaders dedicating portions of their claims to growing grass specifically for construction rather than livestock feed or grain production. Timothy grass proved excellent for sod bricks when cut at the proper stage of maturity. Clover mixed with native grasses created sod with superior binding characteristics. Even wheat stubble, when allowed to develop root systems for a full growing season, produced usable construction materials for families who couldn't afford to dedicate prime agricultural land to sod production. By 1880, sod construction had evolved from Johnson's original survival expedient into a recognized building system with standardized techniques and proven performance characteristics. The Nebraska Farmer magazine published articles describing proper sod cutting and wall construction methods. The Burlington Railroad distributed pamphlets to prospective homesteaders, explaining how earthen construction could reduce initial settlement costs while providing superior fire resistance and thermal performance. The technical specifications that had once seemed like Johnson's personal eccentricities became standard practice throughout the Central Plains. Sod bricks measuring 2 feet long, 12 inches wide, and 4 inches thick became the accepted dimensions for wall construction. Wall thickness of 18 to 24 inches became standard for structures expected to last more than a few seasons. Roof construction using willow sheathing covered by multiple sod courses and capped with 6 inches of screened earth became the preferred method for fire-resistant construction in grassland areas. Johnson's diary entries from this period reflect satisfaction with practical results rather than pride in personal recognition. His October 20th, 1880. Entry noted that 14 sod houses had been completed in the valley that season, all using construction methods that had been proven effective through multiple fire seasons and harsh winters. The community had learned not just how to build with prairie materials, but why the techniques worked and when they should be applied. Most importantly, the knowledge had become self-sustaining. Johnson no longer needed to supervise every construction project or answer every technical question. His neighbors had internalized the principles and could teach them to new arrivals who continued settling in Phelps County. The practical wisdom that had once seemed foolish had become conventional wisdom, transmitted from family to family as naturally as any other essential frontier skill. When the plains demanded that your world resist fire, the smartest house remained the one built from materials that refused to burn.